You're listening to the podcast Coffee with Mike and Julie, Libertarians Talk Psychology. This is current commentary from an MBA businessman and a PhD psychologist.
Look what they done to my song.
My topic today is about the Ben and Jerry's episode where they commented that the Indians need to be given their land back. And it's pretty hilarious.
We stole the land.
We stole the land.
Of course, I want to make sure that everybody knows I did not steal the land.
You didn't.
I didn't, and I don't think
But
you
your
did.
government did. Your USA.
No, it wasn't my government. I wasn't born yet. I wasn't even the egg and sperm that made me wasn't even in the world at that time.
Well, the argument is going to be that you have been able to profit from the fact that your government stole land from the Indians.
Plus, I'm 2% American Indian.
Well, then 2%. The 98% needs to
Pony up.
pony up. And that kind of leads to the bottom line here. By the way, I want to get into property rights, which is what this whole thing about the Indians is about, property rights.
Yeah.
All this thing that we've been talking about, black and white issues and reparations, that's personal right. Those were rights that people feel like were justified, but they were personal. Property rights is a different category, and to tell you the truth, I think it's more quantifiable.
Yeah, it is. It's more quantifiable. In fact, I'm not sure personal rights are quantifiable.
Right. So
I mean, you're talking about kind of psychological rights, like microaggressions fall into that.
Right.
You have the right never to have somebody call you a name.
And I also want to make the observation before I even get started on this, that both categories, personal rights and property rights, when enough time passes, it becomes impractical and silly to think you're going to revisit and straighten out the past. That's not going to happen.
Even if you could try to make it happen, it's not possible to straighten out the past.
Well,
the past is commingled with all kinds of other things.
Time makes things complicated.
Yeah, a lot of time.
Then you just cannot get it straight.
Yeah.
To all parties that are involved. You just can't address all parties and get it straight.
Yeah.
So the first thing I want to review, though, is this whole thing about the business stupidity of business people like Ben and Jerry's, who were very smart in their Ben and Jerry's business, but they're very risky about making social statements with their company name out in front. And I just want to review my observation as a businessman. I think that's a stupid thing to do. But if people want to be stupid with their private business, if they want to be stupid and make social commentary, using their business to get more airtime, they can do that. It's bad business, but they can do that. Now, but I do want to make the observation that I encourage people to do that. I mean, go ahead, be stupid and see what happens. And whatever happens, it works its way out to a good conclusion. But when there's collusion between business and government, and those businesses make statements and encourage government to rule in certain ways, I think that ought to be against the law. I think businesses shouldn't be allowed to do that.
Yeah. In other words, you're making a distinction between good business practice and corrupt fascist alignments between government and business, which is that against the law? Not really.
No, it's not against the law. People wave their hands around and get upset about it, but they seem to be accepting that business gets involved. That government gets involved in these businesses. And that has to do with contributions to government from these businesses too. It used to be considered free speech for a business to contribute to the campaign of a politician. That used to be considered free speech. I don't consider it free speech anymore. I consider it bribing.
You're making a very good point in that we're in this mess in the United States, partly because of these the lobbying and the uniparty and the connection between business and the biggest businesses with the most money, the connection between. And we're just seeing that ruling by the Louisiana judge came out on January 4th. It said that the government is prohibited. He prohibited an injunction. The government is prohibited about embedding its people. The FBI embedded its people in the media, social media. I mean, who knew?
And of course, that's still happening, and it's going to take a while to straighten that out. But it's clear from the reporting that everyone recognizes that's dirty business and that needs to be fixed. But it's
well, you'd think that everybody recognizes it, but there were several Democrats in the Judiciary Committee that seemed to be so featherheaded they didn't recognize it.
Well,
it's like this in the commentator that I think Russell Brand showed this clip, or maybe Michael Knowles. Anyway, that MSNBC pundit called it micromanaging. The judge is micromanaging. This was Russell Brand. Russell Brand says, they can't micromanage. We're micromanaging them, you know.
Well, I predict that's how it's going to evolve, is the people who profit from this collusion, they don't want it to change. But when the other party gets in power, then they'll be saying, oh, wait a minute. You know, we don't want you colluding. Yeah, we don't want you getting your way through using the deep state.
Yeah.
So we need to do something about this. So that's what I think. That's how I think it's going to evolve. It'll eventually get cleaned up a little bit.
I believe you.
So anyway, just progressing, I want to introduce the topic of Ben and Jerry with this comment from Liz Wheeler. This is Liz Wheeler, 17 minutes and 30 seconds into her Indigenous tribe demands.
Place. Ben and Jerry's says that we're on stolen land, that we should give land back. And so this Native American tribe is saying, well, actually, you're on our land, so why don't you just go ahead and put your money where your mouth is and give us back our land? I cannot tell you how much I adore this and how hilarious it is. Is Ben and Jerry's going to respond? What are you going to say, ice cream people? What are you going to say? You going to give the land back? You going to give back this land, or are you going to be, what, imperialists? Colonial oppressors? Are you going to be responsible for the homicide, the death? I mean, there used to be like tens of thousands of members of this tribe. Now it's shrunk to just over 2,000. Are you going to be responsible for that? You really want that blood on your hands? Because it seems to me that you're one of the bad guys in the situation that you just created.
Okay.
It's the Munchkin voice.
Does she?
He's like,
well, she's gorgeous, so that makes up for it.
It's good to know that makes up for it for you.
Oh, it does.
It doesn't do a thing for me.
Well, I'm sorry about that. So I just liked her commentary on, slightly comical. I just kind of like. But what I haven't seen much of yet, I predict some libertarians will get into this, but what I haven't seen much of yet is a deep dive into the difference between property rights and personal rights. And so I'd kind of like to get into that.
Well, maybe before you get into that, I did go to my iPhone and look up the graphs on Ben and Jerry's. No, did I see Ben and Jerry's? I don't know how to. No, I couldn't find their tag in the stock market. But I looked up Disney and Target and Bud Light. And these graphs, are way down. And I was like, golly, it used to be that the political right was above boycotting, but they're not above boycotting now.
Well, I'm like you. I'm encouraged by that.
And
there's a response to this shit.
Here's the other thing I kind of thought about is, I think it's Edgar Schein said an organization can be hurt by having too few resources, or it can be hurt by having too many resources. Mm-hmm. So in the United States, these companies are flush with money, some of them. I mean, there's tons of money being made by these people. So when you have all of your money needs, your hygiene needs met, and your employees have all their hygiene needs met, and I don't know how happy the employees at Ben and Jerry's are, but I'm assuming that this humanitarian trait that Ben and Jerry's is articulating is passed down to the employees, and that they have plenty of toilet paper in the bathroom, and they have plenty of employee perks, and their 401s are doing fine. So at that point, the mission creep is the problem. So Ben and Jerry like, well, we have all the money we need. We've reached a stage of generativity, so we're going to complain about the Indians.
Yeah.
Now, a struggling company cannot afford to be complaining about the Indians, stealing the land of the Indians. A struggling company with scarce resources, they have to have their head down to the grindstone. So your comment about it's bad business practice, I don't know when a company has got extra resources whether that's actually bad, because the company is going to suffer from poor management, and maybe they should suffer.
Well, what you're pointing out is kind of a business cycle kind of a thing.
Well, maybe it's a cycle.
The competitors to Ben and Jerry's, this is a great opportunity.
Yeah, there you go. There's always an upside to the downside.
And we consumers, we went out when we start recognizing, wait, there's I like Ben and Jerry's. I always go to Ben and Jerry's, but I think I'll go find another.
Maybe I'll try something else. Yeah, it is part of a moving, organic kind of correction when bad management gets ticked.
Yeah.
When it's like Disney, Bud Light, Target made bad decisions.
Yeah.
They get their consequences.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
I love it. And I'm not going to get excited about it, because as long as it's mostly on the private side of the world, it's going to work itself out.
There you go. It's when it becomes government. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to get back to my initial concept of property rights. That private property is something the Europeans brought over to the Americas. That
The
it's
idea.
a concept, the idea.
But you could own land.
The Indians had no concept of private property. They just felt like we're all sharing the land. We're kind of overseeing the land. The different tribes just kind of shared it. And if they ran into each other, they'd fight and all that. But they just didn't have the concept of private property. I want to emphasize that the concept of private property is fantastic.
Yeah.
It was a good concept when the Europeans came up with it. It is a founding principle for libertarians. Libertarians believe that private property is very important. And of course, it's obviously very important.
Well, psychologically, private property would induce ownership and autonomy and responsibility. It would induce good behavior
Right.
in a people.
Well, it does. And it induces good behavior, oversight of that private property.
Yeah.
Libertarians comment all the time that we could solve the whole problem with pollution if it was all private property.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get
Well, it connects, the whole concept connects the quality vendor, the vendor and the supplier being really close together makes the best arrangement for quality.
So the Europeans come over to
I should say
Americas.
the customer. I said that wrong. I said the vendor and supplier, but I really meant the customer and the vendor. Okay, sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. I'm just getting to the private property side of this discussion. That it's very important to the free market, and of course to us libertarians, it's a very important concept. The problem with the Indians is very interesting because, and let me jump to the concept of slavery. That was a private right that was tread upon. That we say, when you're born a human, you have an inalienable right from God to have private rights as a human being. And that
right over your own body.
That's right. And that we, the worldwide before the mid-1800s, didn't have any problem with treading on those private rights. Those were private rights that were not fairly recognized. And in the mid-1800s, people started recognizing, wait a minute, if someone's human, they deserve to have the same private rights as everyone else. The problem is, it's hard to go back in time and get that straight when it comes to private rights. Now, property rights, once there was a
It's hard to
recognition.
get those straight too.
What's that?
Well, when people conquered other people and took over their land, it's hard to
Okay.
get that straight.
Well, that's exactly right. See, we recognize that if you have a war and you defeat somebody, then you can just take their property. You don't have an agreement that you have to honor. It only becomes a problem if you have a formal agreement with someone. We're not going to fight anymore. I'm going to pay you something for your property. And then you honor that agreement and you have that property.
Well, you're talking about ways of managing conflict. You're talking different ways of conflict and competition. You can have, power makes, might makes right, or you can have negotiation and law.
That's right. And we've always recognized that we won World War I, therefore these losing countries, they don't exist anymore, and we have those countries, and we don't have to recognize any kind of property rights within those countries. We just take it over. Now, when it comes to Indians, there were plenty of agreements written.
Yeah,
Government, president,
made deals.
our president signed these agreements. The leaders of these tribes signed these agreements. And some of those agreements, I don't know how many of them, but some of those agreements, the United States government reneged on the agreement and just took the land over after they made a formal agreement.
They made a deal and they broke the deal and screwed over the
Now that's different. That's different from just defeating another military power.
The just defeating. In other words, you're okay with aggressive domination and conquering another country.
Yeah, we accept that.
I don't accept it, but I mean, you accept it. It's been the way things have worked for a good long time.
Well, and how do you ever go back in time to straighten something like that out? I mean, the Comanches defeated all kinds of Indian tribes before the United States defeated the Comanches. So how do you go back in time and get all that stuff straight? But we definitely accept when your military defeats the other military, okay, that's our property.
Yeah, I think this could be argued about stuff, but what you're separating out is when you make a legal agreement and you have the law impacts both the government of the United States and the Indian nation, then the government is just like, never mind, I decided to renege on this. Too bad for you.
That's
and
right.
It falls in a different situation.
It's very different from personal rights that have been tread upon. What's fascinating is that I think the Indians, for a certain time period, had a damn good argument for some sort of restitution.
What about the gambling casinos and all of that? Was that a deal they made?
I don't know what kind of deals there are between the United States and these tribal lands. I think these tribal lands are considered like another country. But you got the Bureau of Indian Affairs and they're getting some sort of government money. These Indians are living in poverty. It's a screwed up system.
It is. I have no knowledge of it.
And it could be that if ever it got into a court and lawyers argued about it, that the lawyers might be arguing that, well, we have been compensating these Indians. We've been giving them money all these years.
Yeah, we can speculate on that. I remember the West Wing episode of the Indians in the lobby.
Oh, yeah?
And that brought some awareness to two Indians were in the lobby and wouldn't go until they had talked to somebody. And it was about the land.
Well,
It's a great episode.
To me, it's fascinating, the difference between property rights and personal rights. So let me go back to the slavery and the personal rights that were tread upon. The black people in the mid-1800s, the laws changed and they suddenly had the right to move anywhere they wanted to. Well, that's freedom. That's freedom. When you can move, you have freedom. And the Jim Crow laws were an infringement on freedom but those people could move. I mean, it was a screwball thing, but it was an infringement on personal property,
And this is the mid
on
1800s
personal rights. I'm
after the
sorry,
Civil War.
personal rights. Let me get that straight.
You're talking personal rights, meaning a person's body and their right to locomote.
Their right to operate in your society.
Yeah.
Your right to go into a restaurant.
Liberty, the right of liberty.
Liberty.
And also bodily, and that someone can't enslave you. You know, which amendment it was that said no more slavery or indentured servitude
That's right.
unless you're a criminal and in
That's
jail.
right. So there were personal rights that were infringed on even after the 13th Amendment. And it took decades to try to straighten it out. But let me compare that to the Indians. The Indians were massacred. The slaves were not slaughtered. The Indians were slaughtered. And they not only got whole villages and tribes, men, women, and children murdered, but they had agreements. They had formal agreements between the U.S. government and some of these tribes, which the U.S. government reneged on. Some of them, at least some of them. And so they not only had
It was
property
more like
rights.
a war against the Indians.
Well, it was a war, but that doesn't negate that there were property rights. There was private property and property rights agreements that were within broken.
Yeah,
Those
yeah.
were
I mean,
agreements
I
were
think
broken.
you've
And I
established
think
that.
for at least a time period, I spoke with my brother, who was educated as an attorney, and I spoke with my business partner, who is
Creek.
is
No,
a
it's
voting member of the Muskogee Creek Indian tribe, and both of them were saying, there's this time period where it becomes impractical to try to straighten it out. My brother used the term prescription and statute of limitations, and Steve just said it's silly and impractical to think we could ever straighten this out, given all the time it's taken, time and generations that have taken place.
Well, and then there's just something that's common sense, which how do you penalize the present population of people for something that was done by their great-great-great-grandfathers and mothers? And I would have to say, from a female's perspective, I didn't have any vote.
Yeah, you females, y'all
We
are
didn't get
innocent.
to vote until like 1920.
Yeah,
So-
y'all are innocent.
I was like,
You
I couldn't
aren't-
vote on anything.
You aren't innocent. You aren't
My
guilty of
female
anything until after the
ancestors,
1920s.
yeah, my female ancestors had nothing to do with anything. My mother was born in 1925. She was the first. My grandmother didn't vote, so,
Yeah.
well, maybe my grandmother voted in the 1920s and 30s.
And that's pretty much the argument. I don't need to get into personal rights and
You kind of found something you're interested in with the difference between your view of what's personal and what's property. But I would say that you could conceptually call a person's body their property.
Yeah.
That's the women's movement said, my body is my property,
that's
not
right.
your property to make law. You don't make laws about my body.
Well, the way the libertarians phrase it is that if you're born human, you have an inalienable right over your body, and you have a right to the physical things that your body produces,
Yeah, your own work.
your work. So
Yeah, and that was established in the Civil War when we finally said you can't have slavery.
Right.
You can't have jurisdiction over somebody else's body.
Right.
So those,
So that was straightened out legally after the Civil War.
it only took another 50 years to say that women had the right to their bodies.
That's right. So, in fact, let's end it with that comment right there.